D&D isn't all about winning and losing, but it sure is nice to perform well in encounters. And to do that, we try to make the best decisions we can about our characters and their loadouts. It's easy to read a guide or go through a tier list and be swayed by the author's reasoning, but we can do better and come up with picks that are tailored to you if we take a little time to understand the basics of valuation and utility. By the time we're done, you'll be equipped to assess for yourself how spells, features, magic items, or any other options stack up against each other depending on your circumstances. If we want to come up with a good estimate of value, we need a complete model and reasonable inputs. Let's try applying this to a classic spell, Fireball, which most players will know deals 8d6 damage, which comes out to an average of 28. This is true, but the model is nowhere near complete yet. High dexterity saves, evasion-like abilities, resistances, immunities, and so on mean that you should expect to reduce an enemy's hit points by less than 28. For the model to be complete, it needs to account for major factors like these that can impact its performance. An aspect of Fireball that does often get included in models, even as other factors are overlooked, is how many enemies might be caught in its blast radius. It's fun to think about all the damage you could do to a pike formation, but unless you're facing that sort of thing regularly, maybe 3 enemies is a better assumption to start with, at least from my experience. This is the crux of accurate valuation, predicting real-world performance. We take into account the biggest determinants of the benefit gained from casting Fireball, for better and for worse, and we plug in realistic inputs that represent what we would expect in a typical encounter, neither the best nor worst case scenarios, but the most likely scenarios. Now that we have a framework for using a model and inputs to determine value, let's build on it a little more. What other things might increase or decrease a Fireball's value that isn't immediately obvious from the rules text? How about the caster's bonus to initiative? Enemies tend to be more tightly grouped and separate from your allies at the start of a fight, making round 1, turn 1 the ideal timing to throw a Fireball in a lot of encounters. Something we might choose to omit, however, is Fireball's property of igniting flammable objects. This is because its impact probably won't be worth complicating the model for. Complete doesn't mean exhaustive. The idea is to not miss anything that would have an impact that's big enough to affect your decisions. The approach up to this point has been to value something by itself, which is called absolute valuation. A shortcut we can often take is to compare it to something. This is called relative valuation and is actually more useful to us in most cases. Let's say there's a 3rd level AoE damage spell with a new Unearthed Arcana. One of the first questions that will be asked is, how does it stack up against Fireball? Because we're comparing it to a very well understood benchmark, it's faster than absolute valuation and actually answers the question of whether it's a good spell in its category. Alright, quick recap of the key points of valuation before moving on to utility. The goal is to identify the best option among those available, and to do that, we need to accurately predict how much benefit we'll get out of them. We don't want to overvalue only to be disappointed later when it doesn't live up to our expectations, nor do we want to undervalue something that would have been very useful. So, be thorough, be realistic, and most importantly, be aware of what biases and assumptions factor into your assessments. Now, let's move on to utility. The simplest definition is that it's a concept in economics that describes how good or bad something is to you. This includes usefulness, dollar value, and even how much you just like it. I know it's extremely vague, there's no way around it because it needs to work for any good or service. However, that vagueness works in our favor here. Instead of forcing everything to be measured in terms of damage or gold, we can just assign arbitrary units called utils to express how much better or worse our options are in relation to each other. For example, someone might assign Warcaster, Metamagic Adept, and Spell Sniper 8, 6, and 5 utils respectively. These numbers don't mean anything on their own, it just reflects their preferences between these 3 feats. You can think of it as constructing your own tier list at this point, and this next concept will really make it tailored to you and the game you're playing. In D&D, as in most games, mobility is king, and this makes Misty Step, Thunderstep, and Dimension Door all excellent choices if they're available. You can't go wrong with any one of them. But what about 2 of them? And would you ever want all 3? This is marginal utility in action, specifically the diminishing marginal utility of the 2nd and 3rd investment into basically the same capability. Another example would be that Magic Initiate isn't really helpful for full casters, but for non-casters, it opens up a whole new set of options. The opposite can be true as well. These are synergies or combos. Barbarians can deal more damage with Reckless Attack, but this doesn't detract from the value of Great Weapon Master, which has the same goal of more damage. In fact, Reckless Attack and Great Weapon Master make each other more valuable. Now for the final layer, taking your entire party into account. If you've got a rogue, Knock won't see a lot of use. The alert feat isn't as good if someone has a weapon of warning. You understand this concept already. It's why most players want diversity in the party, with different roles being filled by everyone. Partly out of courtesy, so as to not step on each other's toes, but also because the party as a whole will be more likely to have better answers to a wider variety of problems. So the takeaway here is that the question, how good is this option, isn't complete. What you should be asking is, how good is this option, given what we already have? Of course, the question of whether something is good depends on the context, so let's zoom out a bit and consider what it is we're actually trying to accomplish with a spell like Fireball. Why is it that we want to do damage in the first place? To kill an enemy is something we can achieve, but isn't the only thing we care about. For now, let's say the goal is to address a combat encounter such that the party can continue or complete an adventure. Now we realize that damage is a means to an end, it just happens to be a very convenient and often useful means. But now we start considering and measuring against Fireball alternatives like Hypnotic Pattern to swing the action economy, or using Clairvoyance to avoid combat altogether. The point here is to seriously consider whether the output of the model is what you truly want to optimize for. A great example of this is healing spells. The obvious metric is number of hit points regained, but a better definition of what we actually care about is enabling the party members to continue using their resources and capabilities in pursuit of the party's goals. Notice how that definition is consistent with Healing Word being so highly valued despite its objectively lower efficiency compared to Cure Wounds. It recognizes that taking a bonus action and having a 60-foot range is material, but the difference between 8 and 10 HP is not. On the other end of the spectrum, Aura of Vitality is costlier and slower, but restoring an average of 70 HP across multiple creatures means it is very much in line with our objective. This 0th step of valuation is inherently mired in semantics, but the more care you put into precisely defining what it is you actually want, the more your choices will help you get there. Alright, we're almost done. Just want to squeeze in a few more ideas before wrapping up. First, you might find that an option you chose doesn't live up to your expectations the first few times you get to use it. Maybe your scrying target made their save, or didn't give you great intel. Because we're working with a small sample size, we need to be very careful about what we take away from those points of data. You may have made a great choice and it just hasn't paid off yet. Picard said it best, "It is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose." The opposite is equally true, and perhaps more insidious. When a poor decision leads to a good outcome, it goes unexamined, and the weakness remains hidden. Also, there are situations where you don't care about the average, median, or most likely outcome. Maybe you can't afford to fail and need a high floor. Features and spells that are great for this include Reliable Talent, Magic Missile, Pass Without Trace, and Wall of Force. All of these either make it impossible to do worse than average, or just works without a chance of failing. Conversely, you might want the ability to gamble on a high ceiling. It could be that it's very situational but without substitute when needed, like Dramage's Instant Summons, or it's high investment for an all-or-nothing outcome like Feeble Mind. These options can be great fun and certainly have their place, but remember, they are volatile by nature, so be prepared for them to flop. Okay, that brings us to the end, so let's recap some of the key points. First, valuation is all about predicting how much an option will help you reach your goal. In the real world, it's almost always wealth, but in-game, it's up to you to carefully define your objectives so that your choices can help you achieve them. Adding on the concept of utility, we can compare options that do very different things, and to go one step further, take the context into account, including, but not limited to, your current loadout, feature options, party numbers, preferred playstyles and strategies, your DM's tendencies, the setting, present and future enemies, and so on. Finally, it's important to keep in mind that everything we've talked about today is predicated on the goal being some sort of optimization. If that isn't a goal for you or your group, that's fine. Nothing about this approach to valuation and utility maximization undermines you and your group's views on how you want to play D&D. I really want to emphasize this, maybe above everything else. Not picking the highest value option does not make you wrong. Okay, that's all from me on valuation and utility. Let me know if this changes the way you'll think about your choices next time you level up, or if what you learned explains why the D&D community's consensus on some picks doesn't seem to apply to your character or your groups. Thanks for dropping by. Play well.